AI has been synonymous with.
Obviously, you've been a designer for 20 plus years. What's going on in this light painting that you're doing?
So this is it feels solid and it feels tangible, but actually there's this interesting sort of field of potential literally around the reader.
How do you make it feel woven into the experience without it being, like you said, you could just ultimately add loads of sparkle, buttons, interactions here, there and everywhere.
You're not getting away from the fact there are human beings using these software tools. Understand these flows, where are the touch points in those flows where you can add based on what you know about these capabilities.
Instead of having the deck, jumping on the call, presenting it, just, no, actually you've got to propose this to me over the phone.
A wonderful trick that somebody I worked with, Kai Turner, he had this wonderful way of storyboarding, which was he would have a little cartoon picture of a person.
What's something that most people misunderstand?
Without actually thinking about kind of what are you trying to do. Vibe coding or vibe designing, whatever you want to call it, vibe X, brings us full circle back to that. You're expressing in a prompt something you want to get done.
What do you think something that you would be pursuing or looking into to make yourself a bit more future-proof?
It's a tricky one.
Hi, Matt.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for joining. I'm really looking forward to talk everything Miro related, AI related, and all your other amazing experience that you've had. But I did want to start, interestingly, when I was going through your portfolio, I saw this picture. I'll show it on here. If you've seen it, because we do some communication before we get here. It's not as if you don't know what I'm referring to. Yeah. I'll bring this up obviously on the camera, but it's obviously this picture that we sent.
Yes.
And
light painting.
What's going on in this light painting that you're doing? But also, yeah, I'd love to know what's going on in your garage as well, all the gadgets and stuff.
Light painting is a bit of a preoccupation that I think probably first came from, I mean, when you first do it as kids and, waving a sparkling around or whatever it might be, there's something sort of really interesting about what's happening there. You sort of become aware of like your perception is not quite what you think it is. You get these trails of light in your eyes. You get kind of these odd artifacts that come from what you're doing, waving a sparkler or whatever it might be. And so then sort of capturing light in that way is sort of somehow really magical, really, really interesting. When I worked with Timo Arnold at BERG, he and our other partner, Jack Schultz, there were working on a project which was about visualizing radio. So particularly being able to visualize RFID fields. So the radio fields around things like the Oyster card reader in the London Underground transport network, or many other transport networks have them now, right? And our bank cards have them. And it's a very familiar part of everyday life, this kind of touch interaction. Back in this sort of 2007, 2008, was pretty new stuff. And so Timo, as part of his thesis for his PhD, was working on this project with Jack, and they created an experiment which was around basically poking a radio field with an LED. So the LED would be connected to the RFID reader, and on the end of the stick with the LED would be the RFID node itself, if you like, the thing that's in your Oyster card, right? So if you have a card and you have a card reader, you have two RFIDs or you have an RFID that is reading the RFID chip. And we think of it as like a touch experience, we're tapping our phones or we're tapping our cards, but it's actually a radio experience, interaction, right? So it's radio frequency identification. So this is sort of, it feels solid and it feels tangible, but actually there's this interesting sort of field of potential literally around the reader. And so the experiment was to do light painting to illustrate literally that field. So you're kind of poking and with a sort of locked off long exposure photograph or digital image, you're able to sort of get this sort of point cloud of where the RFID field is. So you're light painting a radio field. And Timo went on to do that with other collaborators, with GPS and all sorts of other radio fields and Wi-Fi. Really, really interesting experiments. So this sort of association, first of all, of just like the visual quality of light painting, it's just beautiful. It's also in its interplay with photography, it's visualize something that's there but not there, right? The quality of photography itself is revealed by what you're doing as well. And then you can also use it to sort of make some really interesting, fun images like that one where I was just light painting the logo of the company I was working for at the time, Lunar Energy. Back when I was at Google Research, we had a lot of fun as a sort of team building exercise slash night at a pub, where we were light painting sort of centaur horses' bodies onto members of the team to sort of talk about the sort of centaur model of AI, which maybe we'll get to discuss a bit later. But yeah, light painting is a recurring preoccupation, and sort of it's just a delightful, playful way of image making, I think.
Wow. I've got so many questions. I would probably need to Google some of the things you said as well. Because
Well, I'm glad somebody's still Googling. I didn't know anybody did that anymore.
oh, yeah, well, ChatGPT or other. So yeah, on that, that's really interesting. You saying it kind of speaks to like what would you give yourself as a title? I would say if anyone asked, well, no matter what job I've been in, earlier days I'd say UX UI designer, but now it's just product designer. What would you say? Obviously, you've got a role at Miro now, and that has its title. But what would you say you are? Because you said like about research and so on. What would you say you are,
Oh,
or predominantly been maybe?
I'll take any title I can invoice for most of the time. I would say in terms of, yes, sort of very pretentious, but as the morning goes on, you'll see just how pretentious I am. But I would say in terms of like your identity or the things that you enjoy or the things that you pursue and the things that you think you're kind of good at or valuable at, I'd say it's kind of like a broad-based, I mean, literally, if people ask, I just say designer. I wander across all sorts of mediums and sort of contexts for that. But in terms of figuring out, solve problems with software and hardware, think about interactions. I would probably identify myself in the sort of over the last 20 years or so as an interaction designer. Thinking about hardware interactions, AI interactions, software interactions, system interactions. But yeah, I guess I don't like to get pinned down, or I like playing in lots of different mediums and lots of different contexts. But yeah, interactions, how things make you think things, and then what they make you think to do next. So, working on interface and interaction is about communicating to a brain or brains to give them a picture of what a system is doing and then give them the abilities to react to that. So, what button should I press next? Right. So thinking about interaction in that sort of pretty sort of classic Bill Verplank kind of definition of interaction, or Bill Moggridge definition of interaction design, is probably the core of what I like to do.
Yeah, is the fact that you've been a designer for 20 plus years.
Yes.
The most people I interact with,
Yeah.
they haven't had that amount of experience, and often they're coming from they've done the typical kind of product design, very flat kind of design spaces, and not kind of thinking about ergonomics in any way or anthropometrics, anything like that. But you sound like you've had such a wealth of experiences that
It's a very nice way of saying I'm old, but thank you.
but You really have. Like, I don't know, like, I guess people who are working now, people working in VR and AR and so on, so maybe would have a background and they would have had that. We've had people on before, and they've had that background where they've thought about more obviously physical spaces and that kind of practicality. But it is, you've just got such a breadth basically of different things with the kind of, if you like, bog standard, typical UI, flat design type thing. And then obviously thinking about the real world and how you interact with the world. So I think that, I mean, does that stem from you? You were an architect initially, no?
You're not allowed to call yourself an architect unless you passed part 3 of the ROBA exam, which I did not. I got as far as part 2.
Oh.
So I studied to be an architect. So my educational background is architecture. Yeah.
Okay.
Long time ago, graduated in 1995. And
Wow.
that year was notable in that there was an economic downturn in the construction industry. So there weren't any jobs to be an architect or trying to be an architect. And also in 1994, the first web server had been switched on. So the beginning of the World Wide Web was happening while I was sort of trying to figure out what I was going to do next, leaving college. And so I thought I'll go and play with that. And here I am.
There you go. So you pivoted. You were like, okay.
Pivoted, yeah.
So it's very conscious that you never done the level 3 test.
I sometimes still like have nightmares that I'm going to have to sit the exam. You know, those classic kind of like, you're in the exam and you haven't done the studying. Sometimes occasionally I do have that one and like, oh God, yeah. But even 30 years later, yeah. So, never got that far. Have, as you say, always found myself somehow looping back to the physical, spatial, hardware environments, contextual computing, those ubiquitous computing, those, as it used to be called, all of those sorts of things. Yeah, it's never that far away.
So with your experience, again, like the places you've worked are like amazing. Google, Lunar Energy. What's something that most people misunderstand about design and where it's heading in an AI-powered world?
Goodness.
Because we know the cliches.
Yeah.
But what is being misunderstood? And you go, oh, that's the people are not getting.
Probably misunderstand so much myself that I wouldn't presume to tell anybody else what they're misunderstanding. I think there are things that are, like right now in the last, 3 years since ChatGPT exploded into culture, not just into technological culture, but, into pretty much mainstream acceptance or curiosity. There has been sort of AI has been synonymous with ChatGPT-like experiences, a text-based dialogue or a voice dialogue in natural language with a large language model that's generating stuff. So it's generating responses to you, or it's generating images, or latterly it's generating even, video to sort of increasing sort of quality levels. And so that's most people's mapping of AI is to those sorts of experience. But there's a lot of other flavors of sort of pre-ChatGPT or pre-LLM AI out there in the world. And some of it is embedded in devices in front of us right now. One of the things that I was working on a lot while as a Google research was sort of on-device AI. So much smaller, more sort of functionally mapped sort of AI mini intelligences, if you like, that have 1 or 2 jobs and do them extremely well. And that's at the time in sort of like 2016, 2017, this was kind of frontier stuff in the way that sort of LLMs and, really large foundation models are now. And sort of quietly, it's been getting better and better and better. So we're sort of starting to see much more of these kind of like smaller sort of mini intelligences embedded in the world. So rather than sort of things that are sort of big sort of brains trying to emulate sort of natural language and human processes and thought and beat humanity's last exam and all of that. These are things that are like quietly doing little jobs, using very little energy, doing them where the action is, if you like, in the environment, and sort of changing the behaviors of physical objects and physical environments around us, kind of in quite interesting and sort of profound ways. I think while the spotlight and scrutiny, quite rightly, is in a lot of what's happening with OpenAI or Anthropic or Google or Meta around these sort of like large language models and large foundation models. There's also this sort of like quieter little revolution that's happening in the everyday. And so, yeah, those small little intelligences that sort of have like one or two little jobs that can move very fast, they can react very quickly, use very little energy and resources compared to obviously the gigantic resources necessary for large language models right now. Still very, very interesting to me. They're still going on everywhere. They're changing the world in sort of little subtle ways. They're finding their ways into products. And again, I think that's another preoccupation that maybe came through in sort of BERG days as well, is
BERG days?
So BERG was the agency that the studio that we had. BERG days. We were always very, very interested in not the cutting edge, but what would happen when things became very, very widespread and very distributed and very cheap. I think one thing, just to sort of round it off, is that sort of looking at or examining the properties and the opportunities in technologies that are not at the cutting edge, or were at the cutting edge maybe 2 cycles ago or something like that, which as a result they've gotten incredibly cheap, incredibly robust, and incredibly widespread. And often that's a place where you can find really, really interesting design opportunities and sort of product invention opportunities, because the sort of capabilities of the thing are extremely well known, extremely robust. They've been manufactured to huge, surplus capacity, so very cheap, and they can be combined in lots of really interesting ways. Because they're not the cutting edge or so proprietary anymore, they're often open source, or they have like endpoints that you can sort of combine. So you can start to get into these kind of like interesting new contexts for them, or sort of combinations and assemblies of them that you might not be able to sort of done with sort of such bleeding edge stuff. So I'm always quite fascinated to almost look back at what was cutting edge 5 years ago, and then sort of see how it's getting into the mainstream, and seeing how you could like remake it, recontextualize it, or reinvent with it.
Okay, so you're saying that it's kind of taking those more things that were niche, and then saying now time has evolved, as you said, things get cheaper, easier to produce, and then kind of making it more consumer friendly now and more widespread.
Yeah, redomaining it and putting it into a completely different context that it wasn't meant to be for originally. It wasn't, the use case that was dreamt up by its original manufacturer or original inventor is kind of, you can actually look at the properties of it and use it for something entirely different, which you wouldn't do when it was something which was cutting edge and very, very expensive. But now it's cheap and widespread. You can start to use it in lots and lots of different ways.
So in any examples, like
RFID was what we were examining back in the day, like the sort of things that have sort of come through the mass manufacture and adoption of smartphones, the componentry of smartphones, which now you find in all, lifts and fridges and pieces of the environment, is because we made billions of smartphones. We know how to make tiny batteries and tiny motors to make things vibrate, and tiny radios and really good screens and really good touch interfaces. So all of those components can start to make their way into lots and lots of different contexts that they weren't manufactured for, but they can now be sort of decomposed and reassembled in different ways.
That is just from a pure business point of view, that's exciting. Obviously it's interesting from a technical point of view, but just literally as a business, there's loads, it just creates lots of other kind of branches of businesses, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think again, sort of like looking at, as designers, often we try and look at sort of the business, the sort of business affordances of something, the technical affordances of something, or capabilities of something, and of course, like the user experience that's going to create. But all of those things are constantly in motion in relation to each other. They're never quite set. And I think that's sort of the thing that when you do almost examine technology and technological systems in that sort of material way, just like a furniture designer would look at, wood or plastics or steel or other metals for their properties and their sort of, their sort of their experiential properties, but also kind of how expensive they are. Can they be recycled? All of these sorts of more material ways of looking at software and systems and technologies. We found often designers who were involved in it weren't doing that. They weren't really questioning. It was like solely about looking at the user or looking at kind of the user's context. But there's also there's so much underneath in the sort of affordances of the system itself, and sort of, for one of a better way of talking about it, what it wants to do, or what's the grain of it, what are the properties of the stuff that you're working with. If you're any other sort of designer or artist, you're absolutely educated and embedded in, right? You're kind of like, you're thinking about pigments and inks and wood and metals, and you're always thinking materially. But for some reason, we sometimes don't. We sort of like almost like abstract ourselves a little bit away from that. And I think, again, another preoccupation of mine and sort of studios that I've been involved in have been sort of like moving much more into that and looking at where the sort of human or cultural sort of opportunities overlap with the technical and material opportunities to sort of invent stuff.
Definitely guilty of that. Just because we always do talk about what is, go back to the user. In my case, it's sometimes the advertiser. And yeah, we don't really think of those other pieces, really. So you're saying that there's more opportunity if you look at like outside just.
There's different opportunities. I think more opportunities often. I think there's also, I think sometimes in sort of UX, UI, product design, we sort of try and dress up what we're doing in sort of like, in sort of language of business, or you try and make it a bit less, we try and make it more objective than it really is, where in other sort of fields of design, there's a vast, in every other field, not just in design, economics, in business, anything, there's lots of subjectivity and bias. There's lots of kind of cultural influence that's at play. Everything everything is sort of subject to fashion in some ways.
Yeah.
And I think we try and sort of like make out we're not, and like, we're being super objective, and we're measuring all of these metrics, and we're setting all of these data points, and we're very data driven and all the rest of it. Everybody likes to say that they aren't really. And so there's a little bit of like, of course you're doing it. Of course you're like trying to figure out what somebody wants to do and how they want to do it. And you're trying not to frustrate them in doing that, unless you're designing something to deliberately frustrate them from doing something, which is often, the case. I think sometimes we sort of forget to bring in subjectivity and culture and taste and kind of looking around at the world and sort of saying, okay, well, this is the system we're doing right now. What works in the culture? And you can see this in some software products that are vastly successful, right? Like particularly sort of things that operate more in the realm of media, like TikTok or Instagram, right? Often there's quite a lot of sort of fashion, for want of a better word, that's at play in the way that the interactions are designed, and also the dynamics of the system are like very attuned to which way the wind is blowing in the sort of cultures that they're embedded in. And so I think sometimes we we just need to sort of be all right with that and kind of like own up to that and say, yeah, actually, this is about us trying to understand something about the culture that what we're going to be placing this is in, and acknowledging that and working with that, and maybe making some surprises there or something that's interesting and delightful, but not just kind of like, not just, it's not instead of looking at kind of user needs or business needs or any of that, but it's kind of like adding the bit that perhaps as people who are involved in material and visual cultures and cultures of interaction, what Stephen Johnson originally called interface culture, in his book, leaning more into what we can bring from that rather than trying to, dress up in sort of the clothes of our colleagues a little bit.
That makes absolute sense. Like devil's advocate is, but in practicality, when people are putting together proposals and obviously they're trying to push certain products and features through, that is almost what design is. Design obviously has to work, right? And there is subjectivity in the way that it can work. So you could say that's the difference between design and art, right? Art doesn't have to necessarily work, but design does. So that is where we not dress it up, but we have to kind of put numbers to it. It has to be not subjective as much as possible. So
yeah, I guess I'm calling for a sort of union of the subjective and the objective rather than a sort of rejection of one or the other.
Right. Yeah.
So I think it's not an either or, for me at least. I think they're quite wrapped up in each other, and they sort of, they talk to each other. And I think when I've been in rooms or teams that have been most successful, it's when that's been happening. And that's when you find like really amazing, surprising things that often are quite successful, is because they hit both of those things.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Like Google obviously has levels, right, for their ICs and managers and so on. And as you go up in terms of levels, go through the levels, you're consequently, it's a lot of intuition or judgment and making, because yes, you can always have data, but the data can almost tell you whatever you want it to do depending on how you slice and dice it. Would you say that is kind of the difference when you make those leaps, is that you are not just leaning, like maybe a lower level IC or so would be just leaning purely on the data, whereas maybe someone more senior will have that data and challenge it, and then ultimately, yes, you almost maybe contradict it, and then ultimately come up with
I wouldn't like to presume that those insights couldn't come from somebody with less experience but I think there is something about building up those intuitions, which it's interesting to kind of, the term I see, individual contributor. I think another thing that often those intuitions are not from an individual, they're from a team.
Of course, yeah.
And so I think, and that is the way that those intuitions get built up, is through, a dialogue in a team around kind of what's possible, what's desirable, what's not desirable, all of those sorts of things. And I think, one of the muscles that you start to build, I think, is kind of being able to kind of understand where a group is having intuitions. And I think maybe that's what comes with some experience and seniority, being able to understand where the band is heading, if you like, in the song, and be able to kind of like direct it or steer it or let it explore something that might be a little bit of a dead end. Or so I think that's where maybe some of those, some of those more experienced, or some of those things that come from having a little bit more experience can come into play. But I wouldn't want to say that those intuitions or those leaps couldn't come from anywhere, because often they have come from the ability to have a room. I know most of the time we're not in the same room with each other anymore, but the sort of spiritual room that we're in as a team, they're being able to be support for those leaps from anyone, or let's have a little spike on that, a little loop on that. Let's see where that leads us, and see if there's something there. See if there's an opportunity or a different way to look at a problem. And I think that that's probably where over time you get more intuition just because you've seen more traps or swamps, or you've just seen the places where perhaps people who are earlier on in their journey, they haven't fallen in them yet, or they haven't they haven't sort of heard the little bell ring when oh, there's something there. And it's just, I think, when you're a little bit further along the journey, you can hopefully give people the confidence and platform to explore those things. You can say, "Oh, I've seen that before. Maybe you can sort of, it didn't work, or didn't work for me, or didn't work then because we couldn't do it then, or people were different." So all of those sorts of things, just because you've been doing it longer, you can talk to the team, talk to the room, and sort of say, "Okay, well, I think there's something there. Maybe we should look at that. Or have you thought about it this way?" Or you can reframe things. You can give people support to explore. So I think, yeah, intuition is super important. If you're in perhaps one of those leadership roles, but often it's not you taking the leap. It's kind of hopefully giving people the space and the support to do it themselves.
That is, it's a good way to think of things, isn't it? For finding nuggets of opportunity.
I think it's a big bias of mine. As I was talking to my current team about this, is because I squirm when people say you're a design leader. I was like, maybe, but it's the thing that I'm very biased towards, and almost like seek out in a sort of pathological way, is like being in a band, or like being in and as I've said, like that feeling of being in a room when a room is working, or being in a band when the band are all, just that idea of like you can just feel it, right? And that is something that is somehow now just, I'm not going to get rid of that at this time of my life. It's something I really seek out, and I really seek out to try and make that feeling for myself and others. So I think that's kind of why I was sort of dwelling on, almost like what's the opposite of IC, or the sort of the individual contribution to this sort of gestalt, or kind of this sort of, this feeling of a room is so, such a good feeling when it's working. It's such a miserable feeling when it's not. It's kind of, it's an obsession.
And to that, you kind of, so if you as head of AI at Miro, what does your day look like? I know it's such a typical kind of podcast. You go, what's your day look like? But genuinely, as someone,
Day to day looks like this. But
yeah.
So I'm not head of AI at Miro by any means, but I work in the AI group at Miro, and I head up design there, and support the team that's working on it. My day looks a lot like working with my team, who are working on sort of features and functionality of AI across Miro. Some are very sort of focused and, very much on some of that kind of cutting edge that we were talking about, of working with generative models and stuff. Other work, and a large proportion of my work, is then sort of connecting the dots and sort of like, okay, we're working on this, but how does it connect with everything else? So these things don't feel like, point features, but they feel part of the fabric of Miro, and they feel part of what people love about Miro, rather than, here's an AI thing, here's a thing with sparkles on that does a thing that you have to, like, how does it fit in with the fabric of Miro, the way people love to interact with Miro? It's my sort of unofficial explanation of Miro when people ask me is that it's a real-time multiplayer game for figuring things out with people. So it's started off as a online whiteboard, but now it's way more than that. But it almost feels like a sort of open world game for figuring stuff out.
Right.
And so, like, how does AI fit into supporting that? So how can you bring AI in, not to replace the humans in the teams, but again, like, support them and sort of superpower them and supercharge them? How does it fit in with the real-time multiplayerness, which, you think about your experience with most sort of generative AI right now is very single player. And it's very sort of turn taking, right? You give a prompt to a thing, it comes back, you do it again. Miro is very visual. So how do you sort of play into that rather than, text prompts and text dialogue back? How do you keep it very multimodal? So there's a lot about kind of both in the team itself thinking about that, but also joining the dots to all of the other teams in Miro, design teams and, multidisciplinary development teams that are working on all of these sorts of things. So it comes back again to that sort of material understanding in some ways, like what's the material we're working with here and how do we put this new material woven into it. So a lot of my day is spent on that sort of connecting the dots work sort of across, up, out, as well as working with folks in my team on the stuff that we've got to deliver.
Like, how do you, maybe you can't go into too much detail, but how does that actually work? Like, for example, you're saying, how do you make it feel woven into the experience without it being, like you said, you could just ultimately add loads of sparkle buttons, interactions here, there, and everywhere. But how do you actually make it, like, because obviously that is an aspiration. When I used to be a teacher, one of my roles was like implementing technology within the classroom. And how do you make it not feel gimmicky? Like, oh, here's an iPad. We've implemented technology into the classroom. Yeah. Like, so how do you make it feel, symbiotic with all the learning that's going on? And so it's a similar thing there, but how literally do you do that?
I mean, so it comes back to what we were talking about earlier, right? Like, but you're not getting away from the fact there are human beings using these software tools. So understand what they're trying to do and get on board with helping with that rather than putting something in the way of that. Basic stuff, right? User-centered design, understand what people are trying to do, understand these flows, where are the touch points in those flows where you can add based on what you know about these capabilities. So that's where this kind of like more phenomenological, material, capability-centered way of looking at design matches up to that. Lots of work with really brilliant UXRs, user researchers, who are constantly doing both longer term studies on that stuff and also like much more kind of like guerrilla studies. Designers very involved in running those studies as well. We've always got like the sort of background music of what are people trying to do and how are they trying to do it. And then we're sort of really sort of creating experiments and creating sort of explorations of how we fit new capabilities into that. Coming back to the joining the dots part, one of the big challenges is sort of like making it feel like a holistic tool, as I say, rather than like separate point features being introduced. In SaaS, often as well, I think you're often perhaps the marketing and the sales and the product marketing is about features, or like, we've tick, 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 we've got these features. I think one of the things that's really attractive, at least to me, about Miro is it does feel like feels whole. It feels like an environment that you're sort of in that sort of way rather than sort of disparate sort of chunks of stuff. So trying to hold on to that while you're introducing these new things is kind of like really challenging, but that's the gig. I think we also kind of like we have lots of different design teams work, it's a big product, complex product. So we've got lots of different design teams all working on different things. So we just constant communication with my peers, the sort of other heads of design who are working there, all amazing. Folks who are working more on sort of like enterprise stuff, working more on sort of security, moderation, those sorts of issues, very big for introducing AI, people working more on sort of like vertical solutions type stuff. So constantly talking with them, my boss, Mako Sender, who's the VP of design, we, talking all the time and then showing all the time as well, trying to like show artifacts, show prototypes increasingly, AI is part of being able to do that. So yeah, constant communication, sharing, showing, to make sure that you're connecting the dots and as you were asking, like making sure you're weaving these things in. So one of my sort of like dumb things that my team are like really bored of me saying and hearing is like, I like it when you can describe an experience in an interface down the phone to somebody else. This is one of my sort of like big, yeah, as I say, I'm like a broken record about it. But like, if you can describe, you can talk to somebody on the other end of mobile phone. You're not in front of a computer. They are, and they've got a problem with, or they can't understand something. Can you explain what to do next down the phone to them? Because it's sort of like you have to plant the thought in their head about this visual interactive medium in a really, really clear way. So it's sort of like weird, sort of Pictionary sort of description
Yeah.
of an interface. It's a really good forcing function for, are you making it too complicated? Are you making it too, oddly contradictory to the rest of what they're seeing? Does it fit in? Does it weave in? Is it simple enough to explain? Because ultimately that's what an interface is doing, is it's trying to unpack itself into, but one of the things that I find, particularly to perhaps folks who've come up more in modern years of Figma and, UX, UI and all the rest of it, is sort of saying like screens only exist in people's heads. All that exists is the interpretation of the photons that are hitting your eyeballs. If you are able to process an interface visually, and, accessibility is a whole other thing. But the place it exists is in your head, and so that's what you're working with, is cognition. You're trying to create things that allow people to think about something in a certain way and then do the next thing that they wanted to do. That's it. So while we obsess about design systems and screens and, red lines and la 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 and all the rest of it, that's the gig at the end, is like, is this thing unpacking in your brain in a way that helps you do the thing you need to do next? And from a business point of view, in a way that helps us continue to make the thing. That's at the basis of what you're trying to do. So that's sort of being able to talk about the mental model of what you're introducing in a way that's simple and communicable and can unpack in people's heads in a surprising or delightful way. Maybe if it's new, you also want to play with that. Maybe you want to sort of like get people to be curious and trial and play with something, but feel safe about that. You don't want them to feel stupid. You don't want them to feel stuck. All of these things are feelings, and they're elements of cognition that are triggered by what we're designing. But the real gig is, in here, right? So that ability to describe something new as fitting in with an existing narrative that you might have about the product is really, really important. It has to be, and it has to fit in simply, has to not create dissonance there. Unless perhaps for some kind of like business goal you're trying to create, it's like new and improved, or like, we don't do that anymore, or like, under new management. Maybe you've got a good reason for like creating the dissonance, but you're trying to create thoughts in people's heads with stuff. Yeah, that's the job. And so being able to like understand how that narrative, that kind of picture, that model is going to unpack in people's head means that you have to think about it fitting into their existing narratives. Back to the point about these things existing culture. You have to fit in with what they already think about your product, their preconceived mental model of your system. How are you nudging it along, or like introducing new paths in that? How does it become so simple that it weaves in with that but extends it? How does it become so simple that I can call you up or you can call me if you're having a problem with it, and I can describe in crystal clear 30-second focal, oh yeah, that's this, it's in the top right, click that thing that looks like this, it's there. Oh, brilliant, cheers. Off you go. Right. So all of these things are for me to do with not the artifacts we're creating, but what are those artifacts doing in people's heads? And that's again why we come back to this point of trying to think about the objective and the subjective, because what's in our heads is, different for all of us, right? Different cultures, different sort of levels of interacting with a product. So that user understanding is super, super important, but it has to come from understanding perception as well, not just kind of time to task and all of these super, detailed things. So that sort of weaving in is also kind of it's a checking. Yeah. It's like, right, okay, where did we come from? Are we extending it? Where did we come from? Are we amplifying it? Where do we come from? Are we changing it for good reasons? Because that thing didn't work and everybody hated it, right? All of those things are about understanding how you're introducing something that's going to fit and weave in and extend what you've what people are thinking about your product right now.
Yeah, I think that could be a new way of doing proposals, that instead of having the deck, jumping on the call, presenting it, just, no, actually, you've got to propose this to me over the phone.
Wonderful trick that somebody I worked with, Kai Turner, years and years ago. Kai, if you're watching this, hello. He had this wonderful way of storyboarding, which was he would have a little cartoon picture of a person. This is like, I don't know, 1999, 2000, something like that. So it was, in front of a monitor. So it wasn't phones or even laptops particularly. But all you saw was like the top of their head cut off by the monitor and a thought bubble. And he would sort of say, you have to describe what you're doing in the thought bubbles of what people, so your designs are matching up to this in the storyboard, right? But what's the thought bubble you're creating? Always loved that. I thought it was such a wonderful exercise to sort of get people thinking about what are they creating in terms of that mental model, that cognition, and how are they adding to it, confusing it, all of those sorts of things. Such a really lovely, wonderful little trick. Designers, we were all like, oh, bloody hell, we just wanted, we were all coming from, looking at late 90s graphic design and wanting to be like Tomato or, David Carson or whatever. And no, make it, this is like the early days of user-centered design. I guess not early days of it classically, but certainly kind of in design for the web back then. It was lots of very wonderful, ornate and Baroque sort of flash creations and sort of things like that, and sort of like stripping it back to, okay, what are people thinking about what you're showing them? So he's such a nice trick.
So to check I'm understanding this right, so you jump on the call, you'd be on the call, or no, in person? In person
Often, yeah.
And then you'd bring up the screen of your design.
Yeah.
And then you'd have your design, but then you'd have to have the thought bubble above the design.
Often, even you could start from the thought, but like here's, or maybe you've got like, back in the days when we were doing this, the PM role would be sort of occupied by somebody who'd be called like a systems analyst or a business analyst, maybe looking more at kind of like, what is this system meant to do in order to make money, or, get the shopping cart to the end of the funnel, whatever it might be. And so that the goals or the steps of the system would be kind of the panels of the storyboard.
Right.
And so the exercise, even before you took it to sort of like testing with real users or whatever, or even having a design, would be to sort of, what do we want people to think here, matched up with what we want people to do here.
Yeah.
And sort of having that kind of early on kind of sketch of like, okay, yeah, at this point, we want people to be thinking this or feeling this even, right? Kind of like, you could take it in that direction. Like, I feel like I'm not taking a risk with this brand, or like, I feel like I'm not being duped by this, whatever it might be, right? So I just always really loved that turnaround of perception for the designers to sort of like don't think about what your artifact is, but what it's doing in the world. What is its kind of affect on the world?
It's kind of like is storyboarding, and it's also like the user journey of, you often have like the smiley face and it goes down, and why are they feeling that way, and it's kind of that, isn't it? It's similar to that, but with actual bubbles and maybe obviously more context.
Like it was, as I recall it was a long time ago, but as I recall, it was almost like a sort of brainstorming or an ice-breaking exercise for the team to just sort of shake them out of like just interpreting the brief into a bunch of screens. Like, let's step back and look at that as well. I always just really loved that.
Yeah, no, that's like audio type stuff, isn't it? Like back in the way they done, the audio, the agent IDEO rather. No, not audio, IDEO, in their kind of, product thinking exercise and the sort of thing. That's the sort of thing you'd imagine them like populating, and
it's very much kind of like, popularized and sort of commercialized in the sort of design thinking sort of thing. It's also, when you look at sort of things like, Jake Knapp's work and things like that, he's sort of bringing that into, as always, when somebody points out something really bloody obvious as really bloody useful is really bloody obvious and really bloody useful. But often we forget to do the things that are really bloody obvious and really bloody useful.
Yeah. Yeah.
And go straight into making super perfect Figma, right?
Yeah. And also the explorations around things. Sometimes there's just so many that they go completely off piece sometimes, don't they? Like there's lots of different explorations around an idea when it's probably a pretty straightforward thing you've kind of.
We can get into the minutiae of the artifact, right? Making the perfect, the perfect realization of your design system, or the perfect screen, without actually thinking about kind of what are you trying to do, or what are you trying to enable people to do. There's something kind of wonderful and full circle about people vibe coding or vibe designing, whatever you want to call it, vibe X, which sort of like brings us full circle back to that. You're expressing in a prompt something you want to get done, and this generative AI will express it in a sort of working HTML artifact often, or working React artifact, and so you're almost back to that describing the thought bubble, but you're handing the thought bubble to Claude or Cursor or whatever.
On that little AI nugget, in all the other podcasts that I've done, there's always like a segment to the AI bit. Naturally, obviously, this whole thing is kind of geared around.
Can't get away from it.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm going to ask like some of the bog standard or some of the kind of typical things, but there are things that people probably do want to hear your opinion on. So one of them,
some of them will be opinion rather than expertise, I'm sure. So let's go.
So I was going to say one of them is, as a designer, there is a genuine concern at the moment with many designers, because it's kind of it's very unknown, and of course no one really knows the answer. But if I were a designer now, and what do you think something that you would be pursuing or looking into to make yourself a bit more future-proof going forward as a designer? Or maybe even if the role changes, whatever it's called, but making yourself future-proof. Is it, I'm aware of some people going, oh, actually, I'm just going to be a PM because it's more, you might say, the soft skills, and therefore, it's less maybe on the hard skills that maybe an eng that would work on, and eng will leverage AI maybe more with Copilot and so forth. Or do you think, no, actually, it's about, well, I'll leave it open, but what could help future-proof yourself as a designer?
It's a tricky one because it's changing so rapidly. But I think at least I'd come back to the things we've been talking about that don't change as rapidly, which is, human behavior and cognition, and, understanding people, understanding how people try and use things, how people think about how they use things. So working in that space of user research, of sort of like understanding how people are going to interact with something, and bringing that into kind of the building of interfaces. So as we've just described, like, right now I can describe an interface and it can get built for me, right? It might not be good, but it might work, right? And it might also be just enough. It might be, just enough for what needs to get done. So that element of like the sweating the craft in sort of pursuit of the craft itself feels like it's shaky, right? So it feels like some of that has, because, and this is by no means an original thought, and there are many, many posts on LinkedIn and thought leaders talking about all of this. I'm adding to the noise on this a little bit, but I think, the degree to which we have mechanized our approach to interface design has helped us mechanize the creation of interfaces, right?
Yeah.
So, and that is wonderful in some ways. It means, maybe you can spend more time with users, thinking about what users need to get done, and then bringing that back to your little robot pal, and working on 3 different prototypes for that in the time it'll taken you to sweat over the wireframes of one to get it back into testing to get further, or to try something weirder, or to try something that excites you and is risky. Like, so there's a positive spin on that, I think, that hopefully we can sort of take the steps to sort of make happen. But I think it is, it is very disconcerting to see sort of like things that you sort of thought were the bedrock of what you did, sort of just be done to an incredible quality and at incredible speed, often, increasingly. But then the other part of what you do is still a huge part, like understanding how people interact with things and how you can create things that help them. It's a huge part of what being a designer is, in any medium. As you say, design has to work. It has to, my favorite definition of, everybody hates to have one definition of design, but I always love the Charles and Reims triplet of designers. Design is doing the best for the most with the least. That always felt good to me as a sort of working sort of definition. And so doing the best for the most with the least might be the least time making wireframes, great. You can do the best for the most by talking to more people, hanging out with users more, trying weirder things, going and talking to engineers about the cutting edge thing that they think is a huge risk, but they're really obsessed with. But if they could make it a prototype, then maybe they could convince the VP to put some resources into it.
Yeah.
Maybe you've got that time now. So that's a sort of, that's a glass half full version of it, but I'm going to stick with it.
You're gonna stick with that one, okay?
My glass is very empty, but no, I'm metaphorically, I'm glass half full. Yeah, doing some. I'm all right. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's interesting because in answering that question, so again, the question was to basically how could you future-proof yourself as a designer in this new world? And you
Can't ever future-proof yourself, right? That's probably why we got into it, is because we were sort of curious about the future and kind of where things are going and how you might develop. So I think there's looking after yourself and your family and all the rest of it, and I hope people can do that. But I think in terms of future-proofing, I don't think there's such a thing. I think there's like continuing to be curious and exploratory and sort of figuring out what is at the core of what we offer, which my bias, as I say, is towards thinking about interaction and thinking about cognition, and the, material and cognition are interface literally through their interactions. A very highfalutin way of looking at it. But in both of those, the material is changing all the time, rapidly. Cognition, not so rapidly. As we know, human beings not great at changing how they think over millennia, but often, we can be surprised. So there's that sort of cognition side of it feels like the more, if not future-proofed, it changes slower, and it's a richer territory to kind of invest your time and skills in, perhaps, than getting ever better at making rounded rectangles.
Yeah. And you kind of, when you were talking, that last bit you said is effectively what you're saying, because you're saying, oh, now you can spend more time with users. Now you can spend time with the engineers and explore like potential products or weird things that you never had time for before.
I mean, saying weird things is, it might not be that weird, but like if you've got, perhaps you haven't got more time, Lord knows, no one's ever asking you to spend longer on anything. But in that time, you might be able to make 3 things instead of 1 thing. So one of those things might be a risk or a bet, or or an oddball thing. It's not as risky or annoying to your colleagues to do that
Yeah.
anymore. So that's where the glass half full for me is sort of that sort of potential.
Yeah. And it sounds like the designer just will be doing more things. Like you may be potentially, I mean, you could have still, I mean, that most people would say, oh, we're going to have less designers, but they're ultimately going to be doing more. And you kind of alluded to that, saying that you would do more hands-on with the UXR. You maybe because of the vibe coding, you could potentially start building things and so on. So do you feel like in terms of going forward, actually, you're going to be, I don't know about saying this, but like a master of none sort of thing where you're doing multiple things scenario.
Not so much of a change for me, frankly. I've always been a generalist, so maybe that's why I feel quite optimistic about it. But the glass half empty version of it, as you say, like capital's going to capital, right? Like so if it can do more with less, it generally does. So I don't want to pretend that it's all rosy, but there's opportunity in some of these things. I think there's also, coming back to your question about what are the things that people overlook or don't think about perhaps as deeply as I do sometimes in sort of the middle of the night, is what's actually happening in the mechanics of these generative AI agents and engines. Also is and Brian Eno talks a lot about this, is that the amount of effort right now that you have to do to push these things away from the mean and the average and the usual is both why they're very welcomed by business. Is like you can get to average incredibly quickly, right? But it's very, very hard to get to extraordinary with some of these things. And you have to put a lot of effort into prompting them and cajoling them to do anything unexpected or risky or sort of beyond the mean, because literally they are sort of like averaging over, the sum of everything that they've learned to kind of deliver you something that is going to successfully satisfy your needs. So that again for me is like an interesting place for where does the design team come in? Where does designers come in? Is that sort of like pushing those systems, or like pushing the outcomes of those systems? Again, like coming back to, if you've got the time, if in the time that you have, you can make 3 things instead of 1 thing, that means that you can then bring in that human element of the unexpected, or the risky, or the sort of the new, into that envelope that probably wasn't there before. But yeah, I think there's lots to be critical of. There's lots to be concerned about. There's lots to be wary of. Particularly, designers are not known for being able to separate their worth and identity from what they do. So it is kind of quite psychically perturbing sometimes to see what these systems can do and how they do it so quickly. But yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of change. There's going to be a lot of disruption. I think there is going to be kind of people moving around, moving where they see they can deliver their value around from the orthodoxy of what we have right now as sort of design UX product teams. But that orthodoxy isn't that old, right? It's kind of only about 10-ish years old. Like, I've been doing this for 30 years, and, this sort of orthodoxy of working on UX, UI, working in product in a certain way, it's not old. It's very new. It's only about the last decade of sort of mega companies, mega uptick in tech, large teams, large surface areas to work on. It's going to change again. It's going to change probably in terms of the balance of like how many people are doing what where, certainly.
Yeah.
And some of that is going to be rough. But some of it is going to, a lot of it is also going to be where I think the things that are our core, we're curious about and good at, start to play in and sort of morph into something new.
So would you say that if, as it stands, say someone's in a job, they're at a company, everything's going swimmingly, it's paid well, but they're doing something, but they're working on things that maybe they're not the cutting edge per se. Do you think it's good for them to keep going? Like, and it's kind of, they've done it for a while and it's kind of safe, as it's, well, safe for now. Do you think it'd be good for them to carry on along that path where they're not really changing their skills, but they're kind of safe? Or do you think they're like, oh, actually, no, you should be playing more and exploring these other things, or even going, actually, you should jump from that and get involved with something a bit more on cutting edge stuff, as opposed to this, and like joining maybe even a new company or something like that to get those skills?
I'm going to sidestep a little, but we'll come back. Hopefully there'll be an answer buried in this a little bit. If you're running an agency, studio, or you're a freelancer, whatever you're doing, right, when you're not inside a company contracted to do a thing, turning up every day in a permanent contract, you've got the balance of delivering whatever you got to deliver to send the invoice, right? The thing you've successfully sold, you have to deliver. As a freelancer or a studio, or just anybody who's like working on design or a service even, that isn't in a salaried permanent position, just for the sake of argument. And you're balancing that against the end of the project, right? So if you haven't started selling for the next thing, you've either got to charge enough to give yourself a little bit of a window to get the next gig, or you've got to just weather that and sort of say, right, okay, I'm in this sort of rain shadow of the work that I was so involved in that work, I didn't have any time to develop something new. Whether that's like, and some of that is, prospects, talking to people, seeing what, but some of it might be getting yourself known, right? Or getting like a profile for a certain thing. Some of it might be investing in learning a new technique or a new, a new medium or a new software package, something, whatever you might say, right? So there's all of this kind of like, how do I deliver the work while trying to ensure the future, the future-proofing point again, right? And so when you're in those small companies or even sort of an individual, it's a constant conversation with yourself, right? Okay, so it is coming back to how do you spend your day? How you spend your day is divided between those things. You're doing it. I know often the balance of it might increase as you're getting to the end of the project, but often the ends of projects are very intense, right? So you have to be constantly balancing the future with the present. And so coming back to your question, as I said I would, if you are in that position and it's all going swimmingly, I would think a little bit like that you're thinking right now about how am I, almost, it's a very crass way to put it, but thinking about your, what's my sales strategy for myself after this? Or if this is, when this current thing is over, what's the next thing? Am I increasing my agency in being able to choose what happens next?
Yes.
Right. And so am I investing? Am I playing? Am I making to do that? Am I talking to people either inside the business or outside to do that? But it's, it's a sort of very crass way of looking at it, but like it's about saying, it's like, if I don't do sales while I'm delivering, I'm going to either have like a lot of downtime, and that might be financially punishing, or I'm going to have to ramp up my sales effort from nothing after I've delivered this project. So looking at it sort of through that lens of like, you are a small studio or you're a freelancer, even if you are embedded in a large company and everything is going swimmingly, I think that never goes too badly,
I really like that analogy of just thinking of yourself as a freelancer, because obviously people are listening, if you're a freelancer, so you know that.
Big company is looking at you as a fungible resource, right? They are, like I say, capital's going to capital. They're a business. They don't have romantic notions of you as a designer, perfecting your craft through the years, the core. So you have to think of it as a commercial exchange. you have to think of it as a value exchange, and therefore you have to think about your value. So you sort of have to think of yourself a little bit as like an agent, as a sort of as a little business in yourself, and sort of maintain that the investment in that business, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I really like that. And I think that is probably something that is on people's minds a lot, is like this kind of strategy of what they should be doing. Should they be going deeper into where they already are? Should they be pivoting completely? Should they be trying to almost hedge their bets a bit? Similar, I guess that's kind of what you're saying. You kind of maybe hedging your bets. Hedging your bets is usually a negative term, isn't it? But it is kind of doing that. It's kind of distributing.
I mean, I would also like, there's a reason we do what we do. There's a reason we're not, accountants. Although I'm sure lots of people love being accountants. I mean, there's a reason we do what we do, which is because we're curious, because we are, perhaps depending on who, you're fascinated with human beings or you're fascinated with technology, bit of both, whatever, there's a reason we're doing what we're doing. So I'd say in that hedging of that bets and in that very sort of, that sort of quite cold and calculating picture I was painting, I think there's still a massive role for curiosity and intuition, and sort of having your curiosity be the fuel to that exploration of how you build your value. I wouldn't want you to not listen to those voices, because I think when you express it to somebody else or you see it in a portfolio, you can sort of smell it if it's not powered by something more innate, right? Don't want to say authentic or any of those sorts of things, but like you can sort of see if it's like just for this, like I'm doing this because I heard it was the hot new thing, I looked into NFTs and Web3, you're like, okay, sure. Because that went well. But kind of, if it's genuine, if there's a genuine confluence of like, I'm curious about this stuff, I can't stop thinking about it. And so I was playing with it, and I did this exploration, and I'm trying to bring that into my work. I think it still goes a long way. At least I hope it does.
Yeah, no, I like that. I have to ask you, what very high level, almost a bit fast fire, a quick fire rather, is what was it like at Google? And then I'm going to ask what it was like at, just like super quick fire type, potentially responses.
I'm very good, my huge, long, rambling answers will sort of already show you. But I was very fortunate at Google. I had two sort of separate jobs. Well, I was there for 9 years, and I had sort of like two big chunks of job, and they were quite unusual. So I couldn't say that my experience was sort of like the typical. So I was very lucky and fortunate, first of all, to work in a group called Creative Lab at Google. A very multidisciplinary group. Almost lots of people. My first time working with lots of people who had come from more from the world of like brand and advertising and sort of those sort of creative industries. Super interesting. My first experience working with writers, my first experience working with filmmakers, those sorts of things. And then I moved into Google Research, so working with like hardcore computer scientists. So like Google Research at the time, it's probably bigger now, or I don't know what's happening now with DeepMind and all the rest of it, but about 4,000 people in Google Research, of which about 40 of them were us in sort of like UX capacities. So working with computer scientists, working with sort of cutting edge stuff and concepting stuff with them. Super fortunate. So I wasn't in, one of these big 200 people groups of, folks working on core products or search or anything like that. And, I was very fortunate to do what I did and spend all of the advertising money that they made, I suppose, or something like that. So Google was fantastic. Worked with brilliant people, very, very fortunate, was able also to have a lot of agency in terms of, in Google Research particularly, but also in Creative Lab, of investigating things that were aligned with my personal curiosities and sort of things that I found interesting. So yeah, very, very fortunate.
Amazing. I could just ask you loads more questions on that alone. And Lunar Energy. So obviously you went deep into, because obviously now like these big things topic, like obviously global warming is still a conversation, obviously.
Yeah, particularly today as we sweat through the podcast.
Yeah. So, but you were obviously like, you kind of like through yourself, it comes across like watching some, you've made some videos, articles and things like that. And so you through yourself in, obviously you're in AI now, but what would you, if you were to say your watch is saying stand up there?
And my watch is telling me to stand up, but we'll ignore Tim Cook for now.
In that experience, what are your takeaways and what was it like working there? Again, just, fairly.
Really interesting. I went from Google to Lunar. Google's 200,000 people. Lunar was about 200 people at the time, 250. So first of all, like very, that was wonderful. That was very different. And what I needed at the time definitely was to be sort of much closer.
Why did you go there?
Well, as you say, first of all, like really, really interested in and passionate about energy transition. Still am. Actually, at Google, had done a lot of work on energy, had done a lot of work on solar. I did a project called Project Sunroof while I was at Creative Lab, which was fantastic to work on with an engineer called Carl Elkin and a big team, lots of amazing people. Again, been a sort of continuous obsession is that kind of like we've got a, giant nuclear reactor in the sky throwing out more energy than we can do. We know what to do with. Why aren't we covering everything in solar panels? It just sort of seems so obvious. And so like that's always been in the back of my head. The journey to working for Lunar was actually renovating my house and fitting a solar energy system to it and sort of buying a system from the UK company that eventually would become Lunar.
So that was before you done all.
Yeah, as while I was Google, I was doing up my house in South London and looking for kind of the most advanced solar battery system I could put in to future-proof myself. Using said I didn't want to use that word, but here we are. And so I was sort of a fan before I was an employee. This came along and it was working across software and hardware and brand and sort of telling the story. It's a startup, so you're kind of doing everything rather than being in a huge tech company and doing a niche thing or something that maybe doesn't ship or it's all, you're very close to what's shipping. You're doing everything. You've got you're talking daily to the CEO and founders and the engineers and everybody. So that was really attractive, and also kind of the mission of the company to kind of power homes through the sun was, as I say, something I was very on board with. So that was like 2.5 years, I guess, and sort of very much that sort of 0 to 1 sort of moment, as it's known. Working across brand and marketing, software interfaces, B2B visualizations, working on like prototyping LED patterns for the batteries itself, just everything. It's like an amazing playground, and in service of a really awesome mission.
The next question was going to be about Miro, but with Miro, does everyone, because we're coming to the end, does everyone when they do a presentation have to use Miro, or do they get is it massively frowned upon?
What, to use something else?
If they use Google Slides or something else, other than
we can embed Google Slides in Miro, so it's not a problem. I mean, we dog food our own stuff. Yeah. I mean, mainly because we want to dog food our own stuff. But yeah, everybody at Miro uses Miro.
Right. So okay. So if I'm doing a presentation, I can't rock up with Google Slides. But do people?
No, most people use Miro, Slides in Miro, because we're dog fooding our own products.
Yeah,
it's pretty good.
It's great.
It's kind of nice to have, like, it is sort of like you kind of maybe maybe this is like Stockholm Syndrome or something, but like once you kind of like got these like more structured sort of formats of things, whether it's like tables or documents or slides that you used to have, you would have those in separate silos usually, and when you've got them, it sort of feels like being in a studio and having stuff pinned up on the wall. It just feels different when you can make those connections and make those leaps again, like those human leaps between things. So like having the slides next to the docs and the stickies and all the rest of it, once you get into that, you're like, oh, this is actually really, yes, I'm doing it because I work there, but I actually really like it.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think maybe there's a circular logic to, the sorts of people who like working that way, like working in Miro and like to work at Miro. But
Yeah.
but it does, I've always back in COVID, I was, working from home, and the best money I spent was not on the standing desk and the monitors and all the rest of it. I spent 20 quid on a whiteboard to put up at home because I just realized I thought differently when I was standing up and drawing to when I was sitting down or on a screen. There was something baked into my head about standing up and having a marker. Maybe it is all psychological or something, or physiological, blood flow, or who knows, right? There is something so different about just being able to see stuff next to each other, things, have stuff pinned up, make those connections, and also like that physical act of writing. So I think, yeah, it's an old cliche, but our tools shape us, and then we shape our tools, and then they shape us, etc. But there is something kind of nice about having all of the stuff there and having teammates there and making those connections. Oh, let's go and look at this. Does that make you think this? Rather than let's go to application X now to look at. It's about fluidity, at least for me and my sort of strange, crinkly brain. That works really well for me. So I'm pretty happy.
And what would be the biggest shock for a designer if they were to go to Miro? What would be like the thing they would be like that might be one of them that they're like, oh, actually, you've probably been using all these very individual tools and now you're doing that.
Yeah.
Probably a very surface layer thing to say.
There's a bit of that, but I think coming with that, it's very fast. It's a very fast paced environment. Everything is done in a sort of EPD trio, engineering, product, and design. I mean, I think that's pretty widespread, but it's truly done in that way. We have like very regular, as I said, when we were talking about connecting the dots and weaving things through, we have very regular, our ways of working are very much about sharing, not just within the team, but out to other teams as well. And that is very, very fast paced. It's very based on concrete stuff showing rather than telling. I mean, I don't think any of these things are going to be a shock to anybody coming to Miro. I think the speed is something else there, and some of that is perhaps to do with the speed of the tool or something like that, or having who knows, but like it's a very fast-paced business. It's very flat. A good idea can come from anywhere. We just had a hackathon internally, which was insane. It was like one of the best I've ever seen, where I was like seeing things and going like, what? Literally, instead of like, oh, you were seeing things that you were like, oh my God, I can't believe you did that in 3 days. And it's also something I've never seen anywhere else. Do we have a patent lawyer on this call? It was awesome. So, I mean, of course I'll hype my own company, but that was genuinely like, whoa. And I think also it was amazing, like the leaders of the company were like, oh my God, I don't know what just happened, but this is like the best one we've ever done. So I've been there since November, so I don't have that to measure by, but yeah, it was pretty mind blowing. So that idea that, really great innovative interaction ideas, interface ideas can come from engineers. They can come from one of the user researchers that just joined our team like a week, like, I don't know, was it 2 weeks ago, something like that, was on one of these hackathon teams, and like the team won a prize, and like, you were just like, oh my God. So the pace, the multidisciplinary nature of it, the bias to building and sort of constructing and the sort of flatness of it. I think lots of places say that, like this was like a real sort of like, whoa, okay, this is something else.
Okay. And one very last thing is, is there anything that we haven't spoke about that you would feel, oh, why don't we talk about that?
I never answered what I've got in my garage. That's your original. We started out and I went off on one about light painting and phenomenology and la la la.
So in that picture,
Yeah.
bring it back up now. Yeah, what's going on in that garage?
Oh, just midlife crisis, basically, isn't it? It's a mess. I mean, we bought the house in 2018. We moved back from the United States, and I was working at Google with lots of teams in the States, so I was working from home a lot. And so I wanted to have like sort of a joke between myself and my wife was kind of like, oh, we bought the garage and the house came with it. So I sort of found this like 1930s property, which had like a really lovely garage, which I could turn into a workshop.
Did it have the pegboard already?
No, we put all of that in. So pegboard full of now full of like tools and tape and gaffer tape. So the spread in that picture that you're looking at one to if I can remember rightly, as you're looking at it, to the right is where my desk and so if you go to the right, things are sort of cleaner and more organized over that way. So that's where my computer is, my monitors, and where I spend most of my day. And then as you go more to the left, it gets messier. 3D printers start appearing, drill presses. So that's where stuff gets made. And when I was working for Lunar, there was actually just a small little anecdote. It was working on a lot of hardware design with some brilliant industrial designers and mechanical engineers. This was headquarters in Mountain View in California. And so working with brilliant mechanical engineer called Eamon, and he would send me little chunks of the product, like little, almost like chunks, cut up chunks of things like one thing that we spent ages trying to get right was like the door hinge and like making it hidden, but making sure that like an emergency worker could like open it easily with a glove on their hands and switch the solar, panels off because there's, fire risks associated with them, those sorts of things. And so that's a very ergonomic challenge, which you can't, you could talk till you're blue in the face over Zoom on, and you could like look at 3D renderings, but you have to sort of feel it in your hands and in your fingers. So you send chunks to my 3D printer, and they would print out, and he'd have exactly the same thing printed out. And then we'd Zoom and talk, and like, oh, yeah, that feels a bit funny. Should we make that a bit bigger? So like that ability to like quickly make stuff in my workshop while talking about it with people was probably 60% midlife crisis, 40% useful, but I was able to justify it much more when I was working on hardware than I can now.
Right. And the pan, it's connected to electricity. It's got like this pan. What's like this? What would that be used for?
I think I probably just was like, it's probably just got like screws in it or something. I don't know. It's probably just a pan.
But it's connected to a wire. It's got a wire. I don't know if...
Let's have a proper look at it. Hang on.
It's a pan, but it's connected to a wire.
Oh, gosh. No, you know what? What is that?
Is that for melting things? I guess.
It's a really good question. I think it might be just a coincidence of like a dog bowl in front of a bit of... It looks like something else. It looks like, though, because I've got magnifying glass helping hands. It looks like I have been I don't think I was like cooking up solder or iron ore or meth or anything. Yeah, I don't think there's anything dodgy happening. I think it might just be a coincidence, but thank you for going like full Da Vinci Code on that picture. Trying to figure out I honestly don't remember. It's like 3 years ago now. I thought 4 years ago.
The light art, the light painting. But immediately I saw that, and then I kind of just looked at all the other stuff, like, because there's so much going on.
Interesting project in the background, the pictures in the background are data centers.
Oh, okay.
That our team got to paint. We got to work with artists to paint giant murals on the side of data centers. So those are sort of pictures of Google data centers that we got to put giant bits of art on, which was a pretty amazing project to be involved in.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure to talk with you.
And we made it.
We made it.
We didn't. The cameras haven't melted.
We didn't melt. The cameras didn't melt. The microphones didn't melt. My brain has melted a little bit, but all good.
Grand. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you.